Hello to the folks who have joined us already. We're just waiting a few more seconds, minutes for people to get here, and then we'll get started.
Jason,
Yes.
there's a little bit of construction outside my window. Can you hear that? Do I need to stop that?
No, you're set. You're fine. Just be some good background noise. No, it's fine. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our next webinar in the series of the 2020 ASHE Presidential Webinar Series. I have just a few logistical notes. First, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. It's morning here in Las Vegas, which is the traditional lands of the Southern Paiute. I want to let you all know that live captioning is available down in the bottom of your Zoom menu bar. If you click the CC or closed captioning button, live captioning will be available. We will have Q&A throughout the session. It's a very packed session, but if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature down in the bottom menu, and we'll get to those as we can. And then this webinar is being recorded. Yes, double check, it's being recorded and will be available in, next week or so on the ASHE YouTube channel. So with that, I will turn it over to today's moderator, Dr. Cecilia Orphan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. The title for our webinar is Invisible No More, How 3 Vital Post-Secondary Sectors Are Navigating the Pandemic While Serving Their Students and Communities. As Jason said, my name is Cecilia Orphan, and I'm an assistant professor of higher education at the University of Denver. I'm also a student of how post-secondary sectors, like the 3 that we will discuss today, navigate the challenges and opportunities they face while serving their students and communities. Today, we will be discussing tribal colleges and universities, or TCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, and regional comprehensive universities, or RCES. Before we get started, though, I'd like to acknowledge the lands I am on and in relationship to as a resident of Denver and an employee of the University of Denver. DU, or the University of Denver, sits on the Cheyenne and Arapaho land, who are the original stewards of this land. I also want to acknowledge all other Indigenous tribes and nations who call Colorado home. As we begin this webinar focused on examining the important roles of TCUs, HBCUs, and RCUs in advancing equity and serving their students and communities, it is important to first recognize how post-secondary education and state and federal policy have been used as tools to forcibly remove, displace, assimilate, and murder Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities. My university, the University of Denver, is connected with the forcible displacement and massacre of Native peoples. 150 years ago, on November 29th, 1864, and I'll just note that was the same year DU was founded, at an area known as Sand Creek, a group of U.S. militia attacked and killed an estimated 160 women, children, and elderly members of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. The massacre occurred when John Evans, founder of the University of Denver and of Northwestern University in Illinois, was serving both as governor of the Colorado Territory and as territorial superintendent of Indian Affairs. A DU report, which I'm quoting from, that was released in 2014, concluded that John Evans was culpable for the Sand Creek Massacre. Thus, the founding of my university cannot be separated from genocide and colonization. And I see this webinar as an act of resistance to the ways in which that legacy continues to shape university life, and most importantly, the experiences of Indigenous students who enroll at DU. This week, as I've been preparing for this webinar, I've also been reflecting on the important role HBCUs have played in cultivating civil rights leaders, the role TCUs have played in advancing tribal nation sovereignty, and the role RCES have played in preparing informed, engaged participants for democratic society. This seems especially poignant given recent events in the last week, but indeed this entire academic year. Not only do these sectors promote an educational opportunity, they also promote democracy. So today I'm joined by 6 scholars and leaders who I admire so much. In fact, I fangirl over them all the time. I follow their every step on Twitter and their various educational leadership roles. And what we are hoping to achieve today is fairly ambitious. We have paired scholars and leaders with deep knowledge of and experiences in these 3 sectors that for too long have been ignored or misunderstood: TCUs, HBCUs, and RCUs. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep my introductions to each speaker brief. I'm sure most of you are well aware of their leadership or know them, but if you're not, a quick Google search will show how amazing they are. And our first pairing will be with Dr. Deshawn Preston and Dr. Felecia Commodore, who will discuss HBCUs. Dr. Preston serves as the research associate for the United Negro College Fund's Frederick D. Patterson Research Institute, where he has led several projects that provided professional development to personnel from HBCUs who are interested in honing their data skills. Dr. Commodore, who I went to graduate school with and who's a dear friend of mine, is an assistant professor of higher education and assistant professor of higher education in the Educational Foundations and Leadership program at the Old Dominion University, where she researches leadership and governance of HBCUs. Our second pairing will be Dr. Cheryl Crazy Bull and Dr. Leander Russ McDonald, who will discuss TCUs. Dr. Crazy Bull is the president of the American Indian College Fund. She's a lifelong educator and community activist who has been an advocate for self-determination focused on Native voice, philosophy, and traditions at the heart of the people's work in building prosperity for current and future generations. Dr. McDonald is the president of the United Tribes Technical College and has been a long-time higher education leader and administrator. He is also a graduate of a tribal college. Our third and final pairing will be Dr. Jose Cabrales and Dr. Kevin Mcclure, who will discuss RCUs. Dr. Cabrales serves as chief of staff at the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, where he provides external and internal strategic initiative coordination for the association and serves as secretary of the board of directors. Dr. Mcclure is an associate professor of higher education in the Department of Educational Leadership at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He is an expert on college management, leadership, and finance with a focus on regional public universities. As you're listening, I encourage you to note the similarities and distinctions across the sectors and how they are navigating the current crisis while serving their students and communities. Each pairing will be given 15 minutes. That's what makes this so ambitious. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Drs. Preston and Commodore.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Deshawn.
Hello, Felecia.
Excited today to talk about HBCUs and how they've navigated this unique moment that we're in, known as COVID-19. I want to first start by acknowledging that I am coming from Hampton Roads, which was a land that was originally inhabited by the Algonquian people. And that also I am in Norfolk, the city of Norfolk, which is the birthplace of civil rights leader Ella Baker, and home to Norfolk State University, which is a public HBCU. And so I want to really, looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have today about the unique role that HBCUs have played in this moment, not only in how they have navigated global health pandemic, but also navigating issues around democracy and fighting racism. So Sean, I wanted to start with a question to you about how do you feel HBCUs have navigated this moment?
Sure. I think considering the circumstances that HBCUs have done a tremendous job of navigating this space. interestingly enough, I was talking to a friend. I was like, I don't envy any HBCU president at this time because we're in uncharted territories. Just the way you move their HBCUs do, that was very important, is they put their students first. And so the decision making that took place all surrounded students. I had the opportunity to work for UNCF, who supports 37 private institutions. And the first thing our institutions did when we asked them, how can we support you in supporting your students? The questions became, how can we make sure our students get home? How can we make sure that once our students are home, not only do they have Wi-Fi, because that was a concern, but do they have the technology, the resources such as laptops and computers, so that students can continue in the learning process. And so we saw a number of our HBCUs kind of work together to ensure that our students were safe. We know that a number of students have elderly parents or go back to communities that are not producive or productive for work environment. And so what they did was, a number of institutions that I'm aware of kept their dorms open for students who were afraid to go back home because of endangering elderly family members and or being in an environment that isn't conducive for learning, whether that be violence, whether that be poverty, just a number of things that we had to take into consideration in order to not just navigate school, but navigate life in general. And so we saw a number of institutions kind of do that. And a great example, I can't really go into detail, but Jason will share a link from in the chat from Benedict College, where they talked about helping a young lady who couldn't go back home because it was an abusive situation. And so she was homeless for a while, but once the institution found out, not only did they find her a place to stay, but they also kind of helped her they made sure she had food and dealt with a lot of the insecurities that she would encounter. And so that's a snapshot of a number of things that our HBCUs have really done. And I can really go on forever to talk about a lot of the intricate details that they put into kind of maneuvering and navigating the COVID-19.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point that I think HBCU presidents and HBCU leadership really had to consider, that may have been different from a few of their counterparts, in that the pandemic or the virus was disproportionately impacting Black and Native communities. And so it wasn't just that they had to figure out how to get students home, right? But they also had to think about where were students going to and how were their particular communities being greatly affected by the virus. And so was it safer for students for their students to stay on campus than it was for them to return home? And I think what we've seen in the research around HBCUs, particularly around student success and student affairs, is thinking about the way in which they intimately know many of their students. And I think that played a role in already having a culture that sees their students as an extension of this kind of larger family. Had a different impact in how they approached getting their students home, or thinking about what was best for their students. And also being able, for those institutions that were strained in resources, and rallying communities around how supporting them and getting these students home and providing resources for these students. Unfortunately / fortunately, depending on how you look at it, many HBCUs have had to be creative in attaining resources on a regular basis because of discriminatory funding practices and systemic racism when it comes to the areas of funding and development. And I think that skill set actually benefited them in figuring out how to be nimble and move and adapt to this change that happened in our environment. And so I do think they had to be creative in a way in their leadership, but also they had to be able to communicate with a number of communities, right? So not just students and their families, but we have faculty who live in the same communities as the universities. You had universities that were colleges and universities that are in rural areas. And so thinking about how they were going to be able to switch to online learning in areas that may not have strong internet service or wide access to internet service and broadband. And so I think having these intimate relationships with their communities and their students really help them kind of be nimble in that area and really think about it past just how do we get students off campus, right? And it was more so how do we do that while engaging in the ethic of care. So thinking about that, it talked a little bit about some of the challenges that normally HBCUs face on a basis. What would you say during this time may have been threats to this sector of institution?
Sure. Interestingly enough, you brought a lot of it up, especially around finances and the historical underfunding of HBCUs in general. And so, as we've seen, there have been a number of institutions that are well off, and their endowments are extremely, probably triple, double time what HBCUs have, that have shown concern about the financial state of their institutions. And so, for many of our institutions that are already in a financial state or crisis, it is kind of doubled down. And so there's always concern around that. And then, of course, enrollment. We had the opportunity to kind of poll our institutions, and there's a wide range of kind of enrollment drop from our institutions. While we have seen a few, and I do mean a few, increase, the vast majority of our institutions range from somewhere between 5 to 30% decrease in student enrollment. And so those things become extremely important, as a lot of our institutions, a lot of HBCUs are enrollment driven. And then last but not least, which I think is something that people don't often think about, is the HBCU experience and the mystique about attending an HBCU. You oftentimes kind of lose that in a virtual environment. And so the question then becomes, well, how do HBCUs navigate and bring that same tradition and that experience from an online campus, a physical campus, to a virtual element? And I will say I've seen our institutions do a really great job of that. You talked about the institutions really taking into consideration the types of students that they employ. So a number of their So a number of their students work. A number of their students have to support family. When you're dealing with a large enrollment of Pell eligible students and first generation students, what we are seeing are faculty taking into consideration that, hey, there are students that are still attending, but they're also working because they have to provide for their families because their father or their mother or their guardians lost a job. But then even something that was brought to my attention a couple of days ago, I think it was through a tweet or something, there was a conversation around, hey, big brother, big sister has to also help their little brother, little sister who's virtual learning. So it's the ability to juggle all of those things. And I think what's unique about HBCUs is the amount of care and concern that they take for their students. And so that element, even though it might seem a bit off, it's still there and important for students who are considering HBCUs to continue to consider.
Yeah, I think you bring up great points. And I think also, as these institutions are navigating already, right, compounded discriminatory funding practices, and facing enrollment challenges around the virus, I think there also has to be a concern of, as we see state budgets, particularly for our public HBCUs, as we see state budgets being slashed and state coffers being kind of depleted, in states where there's already an existing hostile position towards funding of HBCUs, how these enrollment challenges and things like that will play out politically when it comes time for states to readjust their budget. for these institutions, and what would their budget line items look like, right? And so I think HBCU leadership really have to consider how they have to politically navigate these challenges so that they won't be used as fodder, ammunition to further hurt them during the budgeting process. But all that to say, right, I think we've talked about different things, but often I think there's a position of criticism of HBCUs, but I think there's often a lot we can learn from them across higher education. And so what do you think that higher education as a field, as a community, can learn from HBCUs at this moment?
Sure. And 2 points. One, and this is just the resilience. I think they've shown that since their existence, that they're resilient types of institution. Oftentimes, when we think that they're going to close or something terrible is going to happen, they tend to bounce back. And so the second point is the care and the attention they pay towards students, especially during this time when you consider not just COVID-19, but just the racial climate. They become a safe space and a safe haven for a number of our institutions, and they begin to consider certain things and make sure that they don't take things away from our students. A prime example will be graduation. If you've ever been to an HBCU graduation, it is a major celebration for everyone. And so I've seen a number of our institutions kind of say, hey, we're not going to take graduation away from you because we know what it means to you as a student here. And so I've seen a number of HBCUs push it back and things of that nature. And I think it's just important that they say, hey, what's best for our student? Because we have to deal with various traumas, whether that's COVID, whether that's institutional racism, whether that's trying to support your family. And HBCUs are saying, hey, let's be considerate of what our students are going through, and let's see how we can help them and address any of the needs that they have that need to be met.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also think that this is we can learn from the way in which I've seen HBCU presidents support each other and learn from each other during this process of helping students get off campus, or learning from processes from each other, and not just trying to be the one school that got it right, but seeing it as a sector that had to figure it out together and support each other. And additionally, I think HBCU presidents are put in a unique position during a health pandemic that is disproportionately affecting the majority of their students' communities. And so these presidents have also taught us how we have to look at a health crisis as an intersection of identities, and that they become communicators to not only their students, but their communities that they're in, and the Black community at large. And so presidents taking on the mantle of not just being leaders, but also being educators. And I think Cecilia's popping in to let us know to wrap it up. But we hope that everyone really continues to think about how they can support these institutions and learn from their leadership and their decision-making processes.
Great, thank you so much. That was excellent. A lot packed into 15 minutes. So now we're going to transition to discussing TCUs with Drs. Crazy-Bull and McDonald.
Ampeto washte, chante washte, nape chiyuzapo. Good day, everyone. I greet you with a good heart and a handshake. I'm located in the Heska, which is the White Mountains to the Lakota, the Rocky Mountains, in the kind of same area as Cecilia. And acknowledge the tribes here as well. President McDonald and I are really pleased to share the experiences of tribally controlled colleges and universities, or TCUs, as we are commonly referred to, as we respond to the pandemic and to the movements for social and racial justice in the United States. There are 35 accredited TCUs located in 15 states. They have over 75 campuses, and we serve around 21,000 students, which both native and rural students. We represent about 11% of all of the students, American Indian Alaska Native students, that are participating in higher education. So we're a significant population in that population. Slightly more than 14% of our population over the age of 25 have college degrees, compared to over 30% of the general US population. So equity is an incredibly important issue for us. And this opportunity to share here in the ASHE webinar really helps contribute to that discussion about how to be equitable with Indigenous education. We are choosing to use our tradition of our leaders telling a story to teach by telling the story of United Tribes Technical College, where President McDonald is the leader there. It's a regional TCU centrally located in Bismarck, North Dakota, serving a Native population from all over Indian country or all over the United States. Through this story, we hope to be able to teach you more about the challenges and opportunities of TCU education. So President McDonald, my first question is about the experience of a TCU with the pandemic. We see across the country that institutions of higher education have faced incredible challenges with campus closures and the impact on student learning. We heard Deshawn talk about the declining enrollment in the HBCUs, and we know we're experiencing some of that at the tribal colleges as well. As a leader of the tribally controlled education movement and the president of a TCU that serves students from multiple tribal nations, could you share United Tribes' experience?
Thank you, Cheryl. How Madaka Makoda Chante was there you have not bad use of. Hello, friends and relatives. I shake all your hands with a good heart. I want to, before I begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional lands of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara people, as well as the Lakota and Dakota, where the United Tribes Technical College is located. United Tribes was unique in a sense that we were already accredited by the Higher Learning Commission to provide online instruction for all programs of study compared to some of our other tribal colleges and universities and other institutes of higher education who had to seek HLC approval to move to online. And although we had HLC approval to provide online instruction for entire programs in some cases, United Tribes is providing online instruction for only a few courses because we're having more success with face-to-face instruction. The transition from primary face-to-face instruction to online instruction was traumatic for the students and faculty alike. However, we had e-learning, which is a GenzaBar product, and access to GICS because most of the faculty were using this as a resource for their courses. There was a familiarity that helped in a successful transition to online instruction within a short time period for the remaining half of this past spring semester. So, but our students were panicking as the K-12 systems also went to online, and they were being required to homeschool their children at the same time they were completing their own courses. United Tribes has student housing, so for those who lived there, they had the option of staying, but many students felt like they wanted to go home, so we supported that. For TCUs, the difference is that we financially supported students who remained in housing and also those who wanted to go home, as they could access their online courses at the site of their choosing as long as they had internet access. So internet access was fine for those on campus, but those residing off campus were having difficulty. 90% of our student population are low income, so those residing off campus and those who went back to their home communities were having to pick up the additional cost for Wi-Fi, which was needed for the online instruction. Internet speeds declined here on campus as more faculty, students, and their children access the internet to complete their studies. The workforce were sent home to telework, so they were also experiencing internet issues as a result of our dated IT infrastructure. The CARES Act providing United Tribes with $1.6 million in funds for IT infrastructure, which really sounds like a lot of money. However, when we went to get quotes for putting the most basic tech infrastructure in place for fiber optic cabling, new servers, new switchers, we were still $200K short. So we're grateful for the funds, but I keep thinking we should have already been there. We should have already had the necessary IT infrastructure to serve our students at the same level as the non-TCUs in the state or across the nation. We recognize TCUs are at the low end of the digital divide, but we do not know as to what extent in some cases. This means we also need the resources to properly assess and evaluate our systems. The United Tribes has been working hard to be a data-driven institution that relies on data, analyses, and reports to provide the basis for our decision-making. So we consciously made the effort to collaborate with the Homeland Security for the free cybersecurity assessment that they provide. And after learning about this resource at the North Dakota University System Cybersecurity Conference. More recently, we collaborated with AHEC and North Dakota State University to assess the adequacy of our IT infrastructure through a collaborative grant project. The reports generated from these assessments were coincidentally timely, as this information from the reports provided direction on how the CARES Act funds could be utilized or would be utilized to address our lack in IT infrastructure. We recognize the funds as a one-time funding opportunity that will get us up to date with the rest of academia in regard to ITE. Simultaneously, we're working on how to maintain and sustain these upgrades into the future without charging our students, who simply do not have the funds as a low-income population. I emphasize the IT response, but I also want to recognize our students for their ability to transition in a short time period, and although there were challenges. And I also want to recognize and thank the College Fund and Congress for the CARES Act funding for providing emergency funds for household needs such as food supplies and basic necessities. There were issues of food insecurity because the entire family was at home for their entire day, and students were wondering how they're going to feed their families. I'm not sure anyone realized how dependent we are on educational systems to take care of and feed our children while we go to school and work. Additionally, we were able to use a portion of those same funds for supplies for our campus cupboard, where we provide food and other supplies for our students through a partnership with the Great Plains Food Bank. But we would not have been able to move to that needed level without the funds that were provided by the College Fund. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge that one of the most incredible challenges that tribal colleges and universities have had to face has been the digital divide, which is a huge issue in rural communities, and it's particularly a big issue on Indian reservations where the tribal colleges are located. Also, the College Fund had just participated with Hope Center to conduct the Real College Survey among tribal college students. And right at the time that we were closing our campuses in March, we released the report, which showed that about 60% of our students were food insecure. That ranged from worrying about food to actually not having food, and 69% of them, not surprisingly, were housing insecure. There's just such an incredible lack of housing in tribal communities that our students were, experience a lot of housing insecurity. The tribal college movement, it revolutionized higher education when it was established in the late 1960s and early 70s by focusing on place-based, culturally rich, accessible, and affordable higher education for Native communities. So the next question I have is to focus on the cultural mission of the TCUs, which is really critical to maintain. Our mission, as mentioned earlier by Cecilia and through anyone who really looks at the work of the TCUs, is to build and strengthen tribal sovereignty and self-determination. So I'd like for you to discuss how that mission's been impacted by the pandemic and the social and racial justice movement and some of the issues that TCUs have had to face during this time with retaining their cultural mission.
That Tribal Leaders Summit is held on an annual basis, and it was canceled this year for the first time in 25 years due to the pandemic. This has been a UTCC hosted forum for these last 25 years for tribal, state, and national leaders to come together and share an importance of American Indian initiatives, collaboratives, and legislation that have, are, or will impact Indian country. Tribes, states, and the nation are all recognized as sovereigns. And we as citizens of these sovereigns need to have knowledge of how these sovereigns work together or not to provide services for our citizens. Faculty are mandated to attend the summit along with their students. Discussions are held and papers are written as part of our effort to build cultural competencies and pedagogy for faculty while serving our students. This is only the kickoff event for United Tribes for the academic year. Throughout the year, we regularly have cultural forums on campus where we bring in cultural experts to share their knowledge with our campus community. Lastly, and maybe most importantly, the faculty are charged with including a minimum of one lesson focused on American Indian culture as part of their syllabi. 52% of our overall workforce are American Indian and 80% of our faculty are non-native. So the effort to go our own through education and mentorship is critical and ongoing to address not only the educational disparities, but also our workforce needs. American Indian faculty, for the most part, are knowledgeable in the culture, and this is naturally incorporated into course development and teaching methodologies. The investment is for employees to stay with us. However, if the American Indian employee moves on, then we hope they move someplace in Indian country and are in service to Native populations. United Tribes provides professional development opportunities through institutional investment, but we also have initiatives such as the College Fund's Mellon Fellowship and others that focus on capacity building. Events like the summit help to familiarize those unfamiliar with the culture with accurate history, the importance of sovereignty, and best practices for future development. Having said that, I don't think it's realistic to think we can do this work in a foreseeable future without our non-native relatives. So we're going to have to consciously educate them with culture, knowledge, and history. The technology is now available to do this pretty seamlessly if we have the proper IT infrastructure. Along with the infrastructure, we need to build capacity for our workforce to utilize technology to enhance this instruction. Many of our faculty and teachers did not grow up with the technology, and some of them have been challenged in this rapid transition to online and virtual synchronous learning for this past year. However, they've done well in the transition. I can say that United Tribes will maintain a synchronous learning environment with face-to-face instruction for those courses where this is feasible. For the career and technical education courses, this is not practical. So as we need the hands-on training and seat time and face-to-face is the only option for those type of courses.
Thank you. I think that, you know, ensuring that we maintain that cultural focus at our institutions is very critical. One of our goals today was to give our listeners some advice about advocacy for the TCUs. And I know that in the interest of time, we probably won't be able to go over all of the areas that President McDonald had identified. I'm going to ask Jason to post in the chat where you can go to the American Indian Higher Education Consortium legislative priorities and also to the College Funds research and page. And then you can also go to the College Funds advocacy page and learn more. But I'd like President McDonald for you to perhaps highlight one or two of the priorities that you think are particularly important. And then if you would offer your closing remarks that help contextualize the work that are the words that we've shared today for the listeners, that would be great. Thank you.
I think there's several updates in the link that Cheryl's provided from the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, so you can see what we're advocating for. And we've focused in a lot of IT because that's so important, I think, in this modern time. But I've shared on the need for IT updates, but maintenance is also important. One of the primary policies to this end is the 24 million we're requesting for existing USDA Rural Utility Service Program to fund a permanent rural TCU IT fund. And this would address a key part of the digital divide or homework gap and long IT capacity building in Indian country especially for the 1994 land grant institutions. And then we'd also request as part of that the matching requirements be waived. On the other end, in regard to closing comments, I'd like to just say the use of digital audio video technology has enhanced our ability to provide cultural resources and accurate histories to further our and others' knowledge of the history of our people. We need to document the historical narratives of our elders who were alive in the 1930s and remember through oral traditions a time when we were truly independent and free. But we also need to remember my dad's time in the 40s and 50s when the signs were regularly posted in a border town off our reservation that no Indians or dogs are allowed. We need to document the American Indian Holocaust that happened here in America, similar to what's happening in regard to the New York Times 1619 project regarding the impact and aftermath of slavery. We need to speak to the genocide of 100 million American Indian people from first contact to the present time. Movements like Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Black Lives Matter are greatly important as our society needs to recognize the historical treatment of people of color was a tragedy that continues into this contemporary time in other systemic forms. We are working towards equal, not special treatment, and unfortunately these concepts should be included as part of our instruction at TCUs and at all institutes of higher education with the goal of education and positive change. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to move us on to our last pairing between Drs. Cabrales and Mcclure.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to join you all and a great honor to be in conversation with my friend and colleague, Dr. Cabrales. My name is Kevin Mcclure. I'm an associate professor of higher education at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington and an advocate for regional public universities. I want to begin by acknowledging that my university sits on the traditional territory of the Catawba people. And I'd like to honor the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this territory within what is now defined as North Carolina, including the Coharie, Lumbee, Meherrin, Occaneechi-Saponi, Haliwa-Saponi, Waccamaw, Saponi, and Eastern Band of Cherokee.
Thank you, Kevin. My name is Jose Cabrales. I am the Chief of Staff. I serve as the Chief of Staff here at the American Association of State Colleges and Universities in Washington, D.C. I would like to acknowledge that Washington, D.C. is the original territory of the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, Piscataway, and Pamunkey people. This land acknowledgement is read to recognize and honor the elders of the indigenous peoples and the genocide, forceful removal, and displacement of the peoples whose lands and territories were stolen from them. So thank you so much for providing this opportunity for Kevin and I to talk about regional comprehensive universities, a little bit about ASHE. Our members serve about 3.5 million undergraduate students at nearly 400 campuses across the nation. And they are very critical campuses as they grant almost half of the baccalaureate degrees across the nation. So a lot has been happening with the pandemic, and we are here to talk to you a little bit about, what's at risk, for our campuses, for our campus communities, our students, with the result of this pandemic. So I'll kick off the first question to Kevin here. What happens, Kevin, or what's exactly at risk if we lose institutions to closure, restructuring, or mergers, things that are very much seen right now in the media of possibilities?
Sure, yeah. So I want to start by contextualizing this a little bit to say that regional comprehensive universities, RCUs, have certainly been victims of state defunding for a long period of time. And there has been conversation for a long period of time around mergers, restructuring, and closure of these institutions. In my opinion, those conversations have intensified as a result of the pandemic. But just for a little more specificity, we've seen conversations recently in Alaska, Pennsylvania, Georgia, all around this question of RCUs potentially restructuring or closing or merging. So to your question, there's a lot potentially at risk, in my opinion, of this. The first thing I'll mention is that I think if we are to engage in any kind of restructuring that reduces the number of RCUs, it has the potential to restrict opportunity. So these are institutions that are absolutely critical for accessible, affordable higher education. Research shows us that individuals' ability to pursue post-secondary education is very much a function of geography and where they're located. And so if we go about reducing the number of institutions, making it harder for people to access these affordable higher education options, I think we simply reduce opportunity for Americans. The other thing I'll mention is that this has the potential to exacerbate inequities. So RCUs play a very important role in educating people that have been marginalized by higher education. And that includes students of color, low-income students, veterans, adults that are returning to post-secondary education. So again, any type of activity that is going to reduce the number of these institutions has downstream effects in terms of our ability to reduce equity gaps or opportunity gaps in higher education. The third thing that we risk, I think, is making it harder to achieve attainment goals. We want more people going to college. We want more people finishing college. And I think being able to move the dial on college completion requires that we have a stable, robust RCU sector. The last thing I'll mention is that I think some of the restructuring merger conversations also implicates the mission of RCUs. The C in RCUs is important because these institutions have developed comprehensive missions so that they are providing well-rounded education for students, ensuring that they have access to the liberal arts, for example. One of the things that really troubles me, I think, is that some of the conversations that I've seen recently involve narrowing the mission of RCUs. And I think that narrowing is part of a view of higher education that instrumentalizes RCUs so that we get more people graduated as quickly and cheaply as we can. And the result of that, I think, is that some of the students attending RCUs don't have access to things like the liberal arts in the way that they used to. And we restrict the ability to study things like history or philosophy to students that are affluent, attending affluent elite institutions. So what I'd like to see is a shift away from this question of should we be merging, closing, or restructuring these vital institutions, and think instead, what do we need in order to preserve them? Because I think that it's really important that they're still in the picture after this.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, just to talk, piggyback on what you're saying is that we, you know, our president, Dr. Mildred Garcia, she speaks with presidents, maybe 2 to 3 presidents a day, just really talking about the impact it's having on their institution. And I can say that they're trying their hardest to really make sure that their institutions are surviving through this pandemic.
So Jose, that raises a great question, I think, which is in your position, you know, what are you hearing from the leaders of these institutions around some of the biggest challenges that they're facing and maybe ways that they're navigating some of those challenges?
Yeah, so many of the presidents, as I said, Dr. Garcia speaks to presidents daily about their concerns, about their institutions. Just some context, you know, RCUs are, you know, the anchor institutions of our communities. So, you know, some serve as the largest employers in the communities, if not maybe just the greatest employer, particularly in a rural community, right? So, you know, these campuses also, you know, purchase their goods in their community. They also receive services from local companies. So when we're talking about buying local, a lot of our regional campuses and universities really serve where they are in what we call stewards of place. So I think the pandemic has really exacerbated many of the challenges, particularly even in rural campuses, right? And you know, because they serve as economic drivers in their communities, the worry really from our presidents is that, you know, it's going to either hinder economic progress because of the budgetary constraints. There also possibly lead to, you know, furloughs or, you know, particularly, and also with continuing decline in state support. So what we're really learning also from our presidents, because of the really hit on budgets that a lot of our campuses are receiving, is that there's a lot of lost revenues. And now, as we're seeing more and more reports, well, how does this impact enrollment? We will see a decrease in enrollment possibly because of this impact of the pandemic. So there's continuing conversations on how to really, you know, work together as peers. One of the great things about our association is that we do speak to each other very frequently as colleges and presidents at RCUs to learn from each other. So I think, you know, with RCUs and being the economic drivers of their communities, they're critical. They're very, very critical. As I mentioned, you know, we serve the 3.5 million undergraduate students across the country at our campuses, a third of them being in rural geographies. So we are very much trying our hardest to advocate for our RCUs, particularly at the policy level, which we'll talk a little bit later. But I think that's the biggest concerns in our campuses now.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned this idea of RCUs as anchor institutions, because, you know, we sometimes overlook the fact that not only are they important employers, they're often one of the largest purchasers of goods and services. They are important for preserving and enriching the culture of the communities in which they're located. They're often important civic sites. And so Dr. Orphan and I have written in some of our work about the ways in which these institutions contribute to community well-being and really invest in community capitals in multiple ways. To lose out on that through defunding or other means, I think can sometimes trigger a downward spiral in communities. And so if it's the case that we as a nation and policymakers are interested in investing in communities that have been distressed either by the recession or COVID-19, investing in these institutions is a way to do that. The other thing that I think is really important that you mentioned is, there has been a lot of focus on revenue loss for institutions and how, in some cases, financials might be driving leaders' decision-making. Something that can sometimes get a little bit lost in that is that some leaders, I think, are making decisions around financials, but they're doing so with an eye towards keeping jobs. And if you're at an institution that's serving a community where you are a major employer, it's not an insignificant thing to try your very hardest to maintain those jobs because of how important it is for the community.
Yeah. And I think that brings a really important point too, and with regards to, many of the students that graduate from these regional campuses and in universities tend to work in, serving the public good. So we have our teachers and the nurses, and they tend to stay in their general communities. Which brings us to another question, Kevin. There's a lot of media out there, especially right now, impacting higher ed. I think, regional comprehensive universities play a critical role in the nation of educating and employing our communities. Why should journalists and researchers care about RCUs and give them more attention?
Yeah, so I could talk for a very long period of time about this. And as a quick plug, we have a whole volume of New Directions for Higher Education focused on some of the deficit framings that persist around RCUs. And it's the case that RCUs, as the title of this panel suggests, are often overlooked and ignored. They're often referred to by reference to some other more recognizable institution type, like being non-flagship institutions. And those deficit framings have repercussions in terms of how policymakers think about them, how donors think about them, and so therefore real material repercussions when it comes to funding. And so what I would encourage researchers and journalists to do is one, make sure that we're focusing on these institutions. As we've talked about, numerically, they matter. These are the institutions where a significant share of Americans are attending. I think it's wonderful that we're paying attention in some respects to Chapel Hill and to Michigan and other places, but the vast majority of people in my state don't attend Chapel Hill. And so giving attention to where Americans really attend means that we are telling stories that speak to Americans in a different kind of way. And then for researchers, I think it's really important not only that we're giving attention to these institutions, but not perpetuating deficit framings and making sure that we are really underscoring their contributions. And so, of course, there are challenges and we shouldn't overlook those, but these institutions are doing really, really important things as well. And I want our research to capture that.
I think to add to that, Kevin, I think, many of our campuses, regional colleges and universities, are home to our, transfer students. A lot of people call this post-traditional student, right? That you have a significant amount of transfer, a significant amount of Pell eligible students attending regional comprehensive universities, civically engaged. I think as we approach the election in a few weeks, students at regional colleges and universities tend to be more engaged with voting. And I think we house the American Democracy Project, which has noted that about 65%, there's a 65% voter engagement rate from our ASCII institutions. So this is very critical, and I think it does call attention to journalists and researchers to really dig into.
Jose, I'll leave you with the last word here very quickly, which is,
sure.
What do RCUs need in order to fulfill their missions through and after the pandemic?
Sure, I think there's a lot at stake here. Now, it just take 1 minute, Cecilia. In March, Congress passed a comprehensive piece of legislation, the CARES Act, and it was designed to provide economic relief to individuals, corporations, nonprofits, which included higher education. So through that act, $14 billion for higher education, and some of it allotted to MSIs as well. But I think that hardly makes a dent on the needs of higher education, institutional higher education, and students. They continue to have that unmet need. So currently, at the present moment, I know that we are advocating for $46.6 billion in supplemental funding for this current academic year. But I think we are trying our hardest to advocate for regional comprehensive universities here at ASKU, and I think the work continues to advocate even as we move toward an election and possibly a new administration.
Great, thank you both. So if I may ask all of our speakers to turn back on their cameras, just so we can gaze on your brilliance right before we close out. In listening to these pairings, I have to say I'm astonished by the deep commitment across these sectors to the students and communities they were founded to serve, and to the critical project of liberation that they all embody. I'm also amazed by how much expertise and wisdom they shared in such a short amount of time. Kudos to you all. We could have spent several days talking about each sector. In fact, many of these folks on the call today have devoted their entire careers to studying and to advancing these sectors. This commitment of the sectors takes place against many odds that we heard today, against settler colonialism, against white supremacists, against the classist impulses of our society. And these sectors have never been funded at a level that recognizes the outsized role they play in advancing equity. In all truth, these sectors matter so much and are funded so little, it's amazing how much they have accomplished. As webinar host, it is my hope that the pairings have whetted your appetite and you'll continue spending time visiting the websites of the American Indian College Fund, the United Negro College Fund, the United Tribes Technical College, the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, and other critical organizations advancing the mission of these sectors and advocating for them at the federal and state levels. I hope too that this webinar is a call to action to continue reading the research about these sectors and to taking steps in your own scholarly or professional lives to advocate for the sectors, and also in your own conversations with students, with family members, with colleagues, to avoid some of the deficit framing and the ways in which these sectors have been invisible or misunderstood for far too long. In fact, I think it's those kind of individual actions that contribute to the movements that these sectors represent. We all have a role to play in understanding and appreciating what they do every day to ensuring that we have a society that provides opportunity to those who have been marginalized, and to creating new jobs, to creating civic life, to promoting education in our communities. Given what we have heard today, it is also clear that these sectors have much to teach other sectors of higher education. So I hope those of us, including myself, at different types of institutions can listen with an ear to learning and appreciating all that they do every day to promote equity, educational opportunity, tribal nation sovereignty, the dismantling of white supremacy, and other aspects of equity so needed in our society, and so proven as at risk, especially during this year, but throughout the history of this country. So thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I think we will adjourn. And thank you too to our amazing scholars and leaders.
Thank you, Dr. Orphan.
Thank you.